At this time, I'm going to introduce the Reverend Dr. Burnell Eckardt. Now, I have to share that my notes here say that he is the Reverend Dr. Burnell F. Eckardt, Jr. But at Zion, since there is now a Reverend Father Peter Eckardt, we refer to Reverend Father Burnell Eckardt as Father Eckardt the Greater. And we'll let Father Peter Eckardt sort that out. Father Eckardt is the pastor of St. Paul Evangelical-Lutheran Church in Kewanee, Illinois, as editor-in-chief of Gottesdienst magazine. He holds a PhD in historical theology from Marquette University and a Master's of Sacred Theology from Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. His doctoral dissertation, Anselm and Luther on the Atonement, Was It Necessary?, was published by Mellon Press in 1992. His areas of special scholarly interest also include biblical hermeneutics, patristics, liturgics, and music. He has devoted particular attention to the language of faith, a discipline concentrating on the study of medieval and patristic sources to consider their way of attending to the sacred scriptures in the framing of their own confessions of faith. He is also the author of The New Testament in His Blood, 2010, a book seeking to explain how Christ's fulfillment of the Scriptures is expressed in the Holy Liturgy, and of Every Day I Will Bless Thee, Meditations for the Daily Office. He is an associate editor of Lutheran Digest, a contributing editor of Logia. He has written articles for the CTQ, Lutheran Confessional Review, and for the Bride of Christ. Dr. Eckardt served parishes in Virginia and Wisconsin prior to his move to Kewanee in 1995. Since 1985, he has also served occasionally as a visiting professor for Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne in both systematic and historical theology. Twice he has visited the Lutheran Seminary in Novosibirsk, Russia, to teach historical theology as part of Fort Wayne's Russian project. He's also written several hymns, 2 musical plays performed in Lutheran schools, and a Christmas cantata, Shepherd of Israel, for mixed chorus, organ, string ensemble, whose debut performance was in Kewanee in the Jubilee year of 2000. Over the years, he's had numerous speaking engagements, including this conference, the National Free Conference of Confessional Lutherans, several at the Concordia Catechetical Academy in Wisconsin, Southern Illinois Pastors Conference, Heartland Region of Campus Parishes in Milwaukee, the Augustana Ministerium Conference in Peoria, Illinois, the Evangelical-Lutheran Prayer Brotherhood Conference in Chicago, International Anselm Conference in Canterbury, England, at a conference for the Lutheran military chaplains in Heidelberg, Germany, etc. His annual conference is Oktoberfest, which convenes 1 week from yesterday, Sunday evening, with a brat feed at his parish. Please join me in welcoming Father Eckardt.
Thank you. I'd forgotten some of those things. I must be getting old. I wanted to mention also, since Dr. Roining was so gracious as to bring this up, the reprint of Dr. Bazin's book. I didn't bring any here. I was remiss in doing that, but I have a sign-up sheet there. It is $22. You can get it directly from Lulu Press, or if you want me to take care of that for you, you can sign your name and your address and let me know how many you want, and I'll take care of the rest. So there's a sign-up sheet in the table just to the right of Emmanuel Press there. I'm supposed to talk about confessional Lutheranism and liturgy in the LCMS, the inevitable move from Geneva Gown to Chasuble. Several years ago, I had a conversation with an Episcopalian bishop in Peoria, Illinois. I can't even remember the man's name, during which it occurred to me that there is a fundamental difference in approach between Lutherans and Anglicans, which is that Lutherans have always had their confessional documents, while Anglicans have always had their Book of Common Prayer. And perhaps as a result, I remember musing, the benefit of this difference on the Lutheran side is that the Lutherans have generally had a clearer understanding of what they believed, while the benefit on the Anglican side is that the Anglicans have had, shall we say, a less embarrassing liturgical history. That is to say, the Anglicans might have some goofy ceremonies like the blessing of pets, for instance, but at least they will perform them with dignity. We Lutherans, on the other hand, would never bless our pets, but that's not saying much because we have never quite learned the appropriate way to bless anything, at least not ritually. We say things like blessings on your ministry and blessings on your day, but if we tried to slip in blessings on your pet, our people would probably notice, and if we actually tried to use some unction for that or any blessing, they would certainly notice. Lutherans are concerned about doctrine, if not so much about doxology. The ideal situation would be a church in which both are taken seriously as concomitant things, according to the old maxim, lex orandi, lex credendi. Corollaries have to do with the weakening of one while the other is lacking. So therefore, Anglicans without a strong body of confessional documents to which to subscribe as to an anchor, sooner or later will find themselves adrift in a sea of cultural relativity, and as we all know, the blessing of dogs is the very least of their problems today. Lutherans, too, without a common service or a right use of the sacraments, will before long find themselves adjusting the inconsistency of that fact, either to the good or to the evil. On the Lutheran side of things, the necessity of consistency is even greater, since the Lutheran confessions declare that the gospel must be rightly preached and the sacraments rightly administered, even if they leave open the question of just what that will look like. So what must happen when Lutheran confessional dogmatic theology is not coupled with Lutheran liturgical sacramental piety is that either bad practice will eventually force confessional dogma to the side, or the reverse will be true. Most usually, in the last generation, struggles within the Missouri Synod have borne this out when congregations have been put into a position to make a choice between a renewed liturgical vitality and the inertia of an entrenched pietism that doesn't much care how or how often the Blessed Sacrament is administered. Tale of two seminaries. A kind of case study can be seen in considering the two Missouri Synod seminaries in the 1970s. On the surface of things, St. Louis had much more in the way of liturgical and sacramental piety and expectations on its side than did Fort Wayne. St. Louis had been, after all, the home of the great Dr. Arthur Pipcorn, a strong advocate of liturgical propriety. His book, The Conduct of the Service, is still in use today among liturgical specialists. His influence on the sacramental piety of confessional Lutherans is well known. He was well aware of the Catholicity of a rich liturgical heritage, was routinely dressed in his collar, and is credited with having reintroduced the cassock and surplice in the Missouri Synod, a big step in the direction toward full restoration of Eucharistic vestments. In contrast, the Springfield Seminary, which would in 1976 move to Fort Wayne, had been led by the Low Church Norwegian Dr. J.A.O. Preus from 1962 to 1969, when he became synodical president, and beginning in 1974 by his brother Robert. Professor Richard J. Schultz was president in the intervening years. None of these men wore a clerical collar, to say nothing of full Eucharistic vestments. I have a recollection of Dr. Robert Preus even expressing some disgust for what he considered the prissy manner in which the so-called high churchmen returned to their pews, hands folded just so after receiving the sacrament. At St. Louis, daily Mass was held prior to 1974, but it was never so at Springfield or Fort Wayne. One would hardly expect, based on only such cursory glances as these, that it would be the Fort Wayne Seminary that would become a standard bearer for liturgical propriety. But the unanticipated outcome was that St. Louis was exposed as much of a fraud, and Fort Wayne soon afterward began to send forth pastors with considerable liturgical and sacramental integrity. A deeper look at what happened during those turbulent years explains this outcome. The famous St. Louis Seminary walkout in January of 1974 came as the result of a recalcitrant faculty and student body whose misguidedness was in part the direct result of a failure to understand, or at least to confess, the gospel according to the words of the Augsburg Confession. Obfuscation and evasion by the students and faculty associated with seminary president John Teachin, did not keep the synod from at length condemning the faculty majority at the 1973 convention. The St. Louis Seminary faculty majority, leading to the walkout, was of a decidedly liberal persuasion, as is well documented by Kurt Marquardt in his incisive Anatomy of an Explosion. Their dedication to ecumenism led them to a decidedly open doctrinal stance. All of its protestations to the contrary notwithstanding, their abandonment of the Lutheran confessions is a simple matter of record. Seminary's Concordia Theological Monthly was even so brash as to say that, quote, "It is no part of the doctrinal content of the Lutheran confessions that they are to be used today as a rule and norm for Christian faith and life," close quotes. A 1970 document entitled "A Call to Openness and Trust," published by a number of these St. Louis Seminary professors and other Missouri Synod pastors, put forward a list of matters that ought not divide Christian fellowship. Among them was the definition of the presence of Christ in the sacrament. And if that definition was not a critical matter, what else could be? The notorious 1973 document, Faithful to Our Calling, which became the Seminex Confession, declared that the church was Christ's mission to the whole person, the whole church, the church is the mission to the church, the whole society, and the whole world. And whenever we Christians live by the gospel, we participate in God's work of renewing each person and society itself. A definition Marquardt calls disastrous, a Calvinistic formulation that at once threatens to distort the gospel into a social gospel. Further, to a church body already filled with suspicion that the faculty was denying the historicity of important biblical texts and therefore not, in fact, faithful to their calling, all this document could offer was God's creation of the universe instantaneous, or was it a lengthy process? These are mysteries that have engaged the minds of scientists, the imagination of poets, and the faith of worshipers for centuries. Each group strains with human words to describe God creating the world, creating through His Word. Similarly, biblical men of faith, operating with the same limitations of human language in a given culture, were moved by the Spirit to portray the creative work of God in diverse ways. In addition to taking a Zwinglian approach that ascribes limitations to human language, this document leaves open the question whether Adam and Eve are real historical individuals or not, and declares that the miracle accounts of Scriptures are neither scientific reports nor tests of just how much we are willing to believe. These accounts, like the miracles they relate, are designed to lead human beings to the Creator and Redeemer behind the accounts. Clearly, something was amiss at St. Louis. The investigation of the faculty and subsequent suspension of the president led to the walkout. The synod responded by ordering the faculty return or be summarily dismissed. This ultimately formed Seminex and left a handful of remaining professors to work out a hasty reorganization. The so-called Minority Five, which included Robert Preus and Ralph Bowman, among three others, had to scramble to deal with what remained at the seminary. Actually, the walkout had been anticipated, as Dr. Preus once informed me in a private conversation. He and his associates were already working feverishly to prepare for the seminary's survival in anticipation of the walkout. Emergency plans had already been drawn up that were quickly enacted. Professors from Springfield were called into double duty on a temporary basis. The seminary doors were again open for class within a few days, and remarkably, the size of the student body rose dramatically to its pre-walkout size within just a few years. Now on Arthur Carl Pipcorn. Dr. Pipcorn was considered part of the majority, though the matter of whether he would have walked out with them has been debated ever since he died suddenly of a heart attack in December of 1973. Although he was certainly not one of the Minority Five, he was clearly conflicted about the matters at issue. When his colleague, Dr. Charlemagne, sent an official request to Synodical President Jacob Preus in April of 1970 that the seminary be investigated, it was said that he wept openly as he was forced to choose between his comrade in arms and the seminary administration. I suspect that he may have stayed with the synod, though not out of any special loyalty to the cause which the minority five was dedicated. His interpretation of biblical inerrancy was suspect. On the one hand, he affirmed it, quote, "Are we not finally most reverent if we say that many of the matters that detractors of the sacred scriptures have decried as error are accidental to the divine revelation and do not affect its substance? And if we affirm, nevertheless, the sacred scriptures are without any qualification the word of God, and by God's own declaration, true. But on the other hand, his name does appear as a signatory on the Faithful to Our Calling document, and his own writing also calls into some question such things as the historicity of the creation account. Quote, "The possibility must not be overlooked that the human author is using a literary form natural to him, but not part of our literary conventions, such as a Semitic form of epic in the first chapters of Genesis." Close quotes. Dr. Pipcorn was spared what for him would have been a difficult decision. Indeed, it seems that even his dedication to liturgical propriety was coupled with a dedication to being irenic and non-confrontational. Dr. Ralph Klein recounts the story of an unfortunate event in 1970 that took place as a reaction to the killing of 4 students at Kent State University in Ohio by National Guardsmen, students whom President Nixon had referred to as bums. Just prior to the evening Eucharist, a certain student rushed up the center aisle, plopped a scarecrow in the chancel with a sign around its neck, "50,000 Vietnamese and 4 bums have died for your sins." Dr. Pipcorn, who was very upset by this, stood up and left the service before communion. The next day, this student came to Dr. Klein's office, not knowing what he should do. When counseled to go to Dr. Pipcorn and seek his forgiveness, the student agreed to oblige, only to hear the professor, as soon as he saw him, say to the offending student, "Will you forgive me?" It is also striking that when Dr. Pipcorn wrote Lutheran and Protestant Vestment Practices in the United States and Canada, a survey, and I think that was referred to earlier by our lecturer, he did not provide any direct theological commentary on it. He notes the steady increase of full Eucharistic vestments among some parishes of the LCMS, but moves on to reporting dryly on the practice of other Protestant denominations without comment, a temptation your humble scribe would certainly never be able to resist. Dr. Pipcorn's enigmatic relationship with his colleagues is illustrated by the fact that at his funeral, which was a requiem mass, any and all in attendance were invited to commune without regard to their confession. And this in spite of the fact that he himself and Dr. Charlemagne had been vociferous in opposing open communion while serving in the armed forces, a matter the latter pointed out in his strong protest to the Missouri District President. Robert Preus. In the same year as the walkout, Dr. Robert Preus was called away from St. Louis to the presidency of the Springfield Seminary. Dr. Bowman became president at St. Louis in 1975 and was elected synodical president in 1981. His antipathy toward Dr. Preus surfaced when, in 1985, the Bowman administration launched an investigation of the Fort Wayne faculty, a move that had all the appearance of payback for the central role Dr. Preus had played in bringing down the St. Louis faculty a decade earlier. Though Dr. Bowman had been one of the minority 5, it had by now become clear that Dr. Preus's staunch confessional sentiments were nothing like those of his antagonist. It was only Dr. Preus whose objection to the Faithful to Our Calling document was noted on the same page as the signatories. Further, a comparison of Dr. Preus to the other Faithful 5 reveals that he alone had taken a bold stand of protest against fellowship with the American Lutheran Church in a 1969 paper, and he alone was involved with organized conservative groups that had been working to thwart the designs of the faculty majority. Dr. Preus even told me on one occasion that it was customary for 4 of the minority 5 to stand together frequently against the majority, while Dr. Bowman was the odd man out. What resulted from the investigation was an unspecified allegation of conduct unbecoming a Christian, and by 1989, a subsequent dismissal of Dr. Preus from the seminary faculty, contemptuously called an honorable retirement, a term reminiscent of how certain St. Louis faculty members had been dealt with in 1974. Dr. Preus appealed to Caesar, so to speak, and in 1994 he was fully exonerated when the Allen County, Indiana Court of Appeals, the Indiana District LCMS Commission on Adjudication, and the LCMS Commission on Appeals all cleared him of any and all charges that had been brought against him. Dr. Preus's monumental confessional status was demonstrated when the Bowman administration attacked him and he refused to back down. Attendance at the annual symposium on the Lutheran confessions suddenly ballooned as hundreds more came to Fort Wayne, if only to show their support and appreciation for his strong confessional commitment. His legacy was ensured, but unlike the dedication Dr. Teachin's students had shown him in 1974, the supporters of Dr. Preus understood well that they were not merely supporting a beloved teacher, but the Lutheran confessions themselves. In contrast to the game of political football that the Bowman administration was committed to playing, was the dedication to the best of genuine confessional Lutheranism that Robert Preus brought to the Fort Wayne Seminary, the same dedication that had first cemented his resolve to fight the trend in St. Louis leading up to the walkout. David P. Scare. Now planted in Fort Wayne, Dr. Preus demonstrated his commitment by working to bring the best of confessional scholars to the faculty. Men like the sainted Professor Kurt Marquardt, as well as Professors David Scare, William Weinrich, James Vels, and Daniel Royning, whom we are privileged to have among us today, and others, formed a phalanx of solid confessional, liturgical, and biblical scholarship. Dr. Preus also instituted the annual Symposium on the Lutheran Confessions, an event that brought serious confessional study into the limelight of the seminary and the synod. Arguably the most prominent among scholars Dr. Preus brought to the seminary was Dr. Scare. Not only because of his voluminous and insightful writing, Professor Marquardt has also an impressive and discerning bibliography, nor because of his engaging style of teaching. Many of the men I listed were also known for that. But because of the inimitable way he encouraged his students to think theologically for themselves on a daily basis. Dr. Scare told me that he disagrees with me on this matter, preferring to think that the written works of a theologian are the most important. And while generally that may be true, what his approach produced were men whose minds, while dedicated to the very kind of confessional faithfulness that Dr. Preus had always sought, men who were at the same time free to think for themselves, theologically, Christologically, biblically, sacramentally. So inimitable was this approach, in fact, that it gained him a load of trouble. His faithfulness was soon called into question by misguided men who, on the one hand, grossly misunderstood his candid humor, and who, on the other hand, clearly understood his rejection of Missouri's parochial shibboleths, phantom articles of faith they had grown to hold dear, matters for which his palpable impatience has become legendary, most especially against any refusal to read the Scriptures on their own terms. This was in sharp contrast to the squishy kind of biblical interpretation the St. Louis majority of the previous decade had tried to foist on an unsuspecting Missouri synod. On the other hand, however, it was also in contrast to petulant retorts against this that empty shouts of biblical inerrancy had begun to become. For there was, after all, some truth in Dr. Pipcorn's concerns. But in Dr. Scare, we find a teacher for whom sola scriptura actually meant something radical. Whatever the Bible says is and must be the absolute truth, wherever this may lead. And of course, it always leads to Christ. Coupled with his own and his colleagues' unflinching commitment to the Lutheran confessions, this enabled students to see the difference between Scripture as the norma normans and the confessions as the norma normata in actual theological practice. It was, in fact, Dr. Preus's defense of Dr. Scare that gave the Bowman administration an excuse to launch its investigation. Without question, the controversy of the early 1970s had not yet been put to bed, but that was not, as has wrongly been supposed, just another battle for the Bible. It was a battle for the gospel and its confession. It was about Christology. It was about Jesus. During the Preus years, good theology was at its heyday. Dr. Preus used to remark to his students that Fort Wayne was the best seminary in the world. In a certain respect, this was true. In fact, the most important respect. At Fort Wayne, there was perhaps as nowhere else an encouragement of evangelical theological thinking. Dr. Preus extolled what he called the development of a synthetic, as opposed to analytic, kind of theological thought. That is, a desire to understand the unity of the faith, how it all fits together, so to speak. Dr. Scare was, and in my opinion still is, the chief agent of that kind of thinking in the classroom. Under the Preus administration, students were not spoon-fed theology, they did theology. So, for example, it was not enough to believe, teach, and confess justification by faith. That in itself is an abstract thing. In fact, on its own, the phrase leaves us asking, what does this have to do with Jesus? Of course, it has everything to do with him, but worn cliches are no substitute for the best of the theological enterprise. To say sola scriptura is one thing, but it is quite another to believe, when you are doing the study, that what the text says is final. Look what it says, Dr. Scare would often quip. The results are in. The seminary during the Preus years did what seminaries are supposed to do. The etymology must not be lost on us. Where there are seeds, there must be germination. And this has led, most importantly, to a robust move to recover the centrality of the Blessed Sacrament and its right administration in our midst. The stranglehold that Pietism had had on much of the Missouri Synod for so long was beginning to loosen. Lex orandi, lex credendi. Finally, the dead orthodoxy that encompassed the Missouri Synod, that had been the environment in which even the best of her teachers had arisen, including Robert Preus himself, was coming alive. The glaring inconsistency of such a synod, now having a seminary openly dedicated to the Lutheran confessions in word and in deed, was being resolved. And so the dignity, the frequency, and the Catholicity and appearance of our celebrations of the Holy Supper was being restored. But we are no Anglicans. We do not perform our ceremonies with dignity because it looks Catholic to do so, and in this, if only very subtly, one might even detect a hint of a difference with the Pipcorn rationale. We treat the sacrament with dignity because this is how the Church ought to behave, certainly, but more importantly, because of what we are dealing with here as we confess, the actual, true body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ, given and shed for us. We cannot do otherwise than to take this seriously. That awareness is at the center of all that we do. Professor Marquardt himself said that this would happen. Quote, "But such living appreciation cannot come from books alone, though they are necessary. It is not enough to confess the Book of Concord in theory. It needs to be put into practice. Preaching and the sacraments are to be done aright, not merely thought about. How can we expect Lutheran people to have a high regard for the gospel and sacraments when in our parish life we so often disguise our high theory with reformed or revivalistic practices which suggest a low view of the means of grace? If we expect people to have some regard for the Augsburg Confession's biblical position on the real presence, Article 10, then we shall have to express and implement this evangelical mystery in our public worship and church life, Article 24. In the New Testament, as in the Lutheran confessions, the sacrament is a vital and central part of Christian worship. Our actual practice often suggests the Reformed pietistic notion of the sacrament as an occasional extra. Solzhenitsyn wrote that the liturgy he heard and saw celebrated in church during his childhood made such a deep and lasting impression on him that no amount of intellectual argument or personal suffering later was able to erase it. There is no reason why Lutheran worship, taken seriously, should not affect men similarly." The seminarians who became infected with this kind of clear thinking, and it was contagious, soon found themselves, as young pastors, desiring in earnest to do something serious about the stagnant and sometimes deplorable liturgical situations they found them in the parishes to which they were called. They could no more surrender to liturgical denials of Christ in the worship setting than Dr. Preus himself could surrender to theological denials of Christ in the academic setting. It was not right, they knew, to be content with monthly or even with bi-weekly celebrations of the Holy Supper. It was not proper to celebrate open communion. It was not fitting to be content with little plastic cups for the precious blood of Christ. It was not appropriate to give mere lip service to the gospel and sacraments. Dr. Preus had shown them that to suffer ignominy or shame is better than to compromise one's confession, and Dr. Scare and others had trained them to apply this confession unabashedly to life and vocation. The inception of Gottesdienst in 1992 betokened the liturgical renewal that came out of Fort Wayne, but this renewal was not Pipcorn-esque, though it accorded high deference to the man's liturgical good manners and even took his liturgical instructions and rubrics to heart. But there was not very much about this renewal that was irenic. Its adherents understood, to the contrary, that they had a confession to make, often in the face of animosity, a liturgical confession, and that failure to do so would for them be tantamount to a denial of the high significance they accorded the gospel and the sacrament. The church had been liturgically languishing, scarcely distinguishable from Methodism or Presbyterianism. Ministers' attempts to make a dry service more interesting had often become pathetic appeals to their own likability. But many of the students of Dr. Preus and his faculty had developed an instinctive and an indefatigable awareness that the church that confessed the centrality of the sacrament must also act that way. Though they understood, usually, the value of patience and careful instruction, and that the sheep of Christ's pasture must be treated with kindness, they also knew they could call no retreat, even if it meant they must suffer for this. They knew that kindness could not be used as a mask to hide acquiescence, any more than one ought to cry, "Peace, peace," where there is no peace. Signs of the recovery have finally begun to take hold. A weekly celebration of the Holy Supper has in many places become commonplace. The liturgy is commonly sung by pastor and people. The new hymn book can be credited with that helpful development. Pastors more customarily wear at least an alb and stole as a standard vestment, and sometimes even amice, maniple, and chasuble. And as for street garb, many now wear clerical collars every day. And the unlikable but inevitable result of the concerted efforts of a low church Geneva gown-wearing Norwegian who demonstrated nonetheless a staunch and relentless commitment to believing, teaching, and confessing the faith of the Lutheran confessions against all opposition was the appearance of a few, then more, then many confessional Lutheran pastors dedicated to teaching the gospel and rightly administering the sacraments. Dr. Daniel Gard, former student and professor at Fort Wayne, now president of Concordia University in River Forest, is on record as saying, "I had to chuckle at the thought of a Robert Preus Lutheran wearing a chasuble. We are talking about a guy who wore a pulpit gown and, as far as I can remember, never even wore a clerical collar. He was surprised and a little amused in the 1990s when he realized so many of his supporters were high church." Thank you.